All right, so we can get started. Thank you to everyone who's here, and thank you especially to Bess. We're so lucky to have her here to talk to all of us about her career path and time at Wellesley, time in law school, and what she's been doing in the mayor's office. So Bess Chiu is a 2003 graduate of Wellesley College who currently works as the Chief of Staff to the New York City Mayor's Chief Legal Counsel. So we'll definitely let her get into what exactly that means and what a day in her life looks like. But for now, I'd love to just turn it over to Bess and have you start with just telling us a little bit about yourself and maybe start with Wellesley and what you majored in and what led you to Wellesley.
Sure, I'd love to. And actually, I don't know if you guys can see, but I'm wearing a Wellesley shirt today. This is my class shirt, which is still very white because I've worn it, I think, once at reunion. So first of all, thank you to Nicole and to Wellesley for having me. I am a very proud and active Wellesley alum. I graduated, as Nicole mentioned, in 2003, so I'm a yellow class. And I'm a lawyer, and I currently work for the city of New York as chief of staff to the counsel to the mayor, to Mayor Bill de Blasio. So just very briefly, my current role, basically, like, what is the counsel to the mayor's office? It's, my boss, Kapel Angani, is the lawyer to the mayor. He's the counsel to the mayor. So generally speaking, any sensitive legal issues, any significant policy issues that are happening in New York City, they almost always have some kind of legal implication. That comes by my boss's desk and our office's desk. And so, during COVID-19, that really meant everything from literally figuring out how to shut down the city to now, reopening New York City safely. So when I was in college, when I was at Wellesley, I actually had no idea that I would be a lawyer. So I started off pre-med. I took a lot of science classes, but I eventually became a double major in political science and in Chinese studies. Outside of, I guess, school, outside of classwork, I was actually pretty active on campus. One of the best things I did was I was a first year mentor. I hope you guys still do that, my junior and senior years. And it was just really great introducing first year students to Wellesley and helping them, transition to college life. And I also worked at the Davis Museum on work study. And so that's one of those places where, whether I go back for the official Wellesley reunions or my Wellesley friends and I are in the area and decide to go back to campus, I always go back to the Davis Museum to see what exhibits are happening and kind of just like revisit the desk where I used to sit and the galleries where I used to do my work. So yeah, I guess that's like my Wellesley experience in a very, very, very small nutshell, because I could probably talk about Wellesley for like 5 hours.
Well, if we have more time, I'm sure we'd love to hear more about your Wellesley experience. But I did want to get into, since you said you didn't know you wanted to go to law school, when you made that decision to go to law school and how you made that decision, because I know it's something that a lot of students and recent alums grapple with.
So my first job after college wound up being as a legal assistant, first in New York City, which is where I'm from. But then ultimately in Boston at a large law firm called Wilmer Hale. When you're a legal assistant, basically you are staffed onto multiple cases at any given time. You don't just get one case to work on, you work on, it kind of depends on the size, but you might work on like 5, 6, 7. And I was really influenced, frankly, by the attorneys that I worked with. I think that even though I felt like I was very both young as a person, but also just very junior as a professional, I felt like I was really able to kind of garner respect for my work ethic. And, I felt like a mutual respect, which is, I think, really wonderful. Especially when you are someone who is, new in your any career, in any job. And I really respected and liked the attorneys I worked with. And this was particularly true of some of the women attorneys and the senior women attorneys. As senior partners, I mean, there were women who like would just give me their briefs, even though I wasn't a lawyer. Be like, hey, you're on this case. Do you want to just read this motion I filed? I'm like, okay, sure. And actually, one of the really cool things is, to me, they were like figurative giants, but they were actually, I think, really giants in the legal world. And it was so great to have those opportunities to talk to them about their experiences. Once I got to know them a little bit better. And the thing is, one of them is now the Massachusetts Attorney General, Maura Healey, which is actually very cool. She was one of the partners that I worked with at the time. And I don't live in Massachusetts anymore. I live in New York, but she was someone who I could talk to, who I could ask about, going to law school and tell her like, I'm considering, I wasn't thinking about it before, but I am considering being an attorney. And I still remember, when I left, I think the first semester after I left, she emailed me when I was in law school just to say hi and see how things were going. And so I do think, that really having that opportunity to meet lawyers and to get to know them, and even if it was just informally, get some kind of mentorship from them, that really inspired me to go to law school. And, it was very helpful for me in particular too, because no one in my family is a lawyer. I come from an immigrant family, none of them are lawyers. And so it was really helpful, I think, just to have this opportunity, in my work, like in my work setting, to get to know lawyers and kind of figure out like, is this something that I want to do? And it turned out, thanks to them, that's where I am today. That's why I'm a lawyer now.
And what was your law school experience like?
So I think law school is challenging, but I think it's probably similar to college. I think for me, it was a little bit challenging because law school is different from actually working in law. So I think having taken that break, I took 3 years off between college and law school, and having worked in law, even though I wasn't working as a lawyer and I was working as a legal assistant, it was sometimes hard for me to kind of blend together, okay, what is it that I'm learning in class and how is it actually going to apply when I become a full-fledged lawyer? And so one of the things I always advise people who are considering planning, either thinking about going to law school or who are currently in law school, is you should do a clinic. If you decide, to go to law school when you're in school, do a clinic, because a clinic is a setting different from an internship or an externship, which are also helpful because you see, how to apply the law and the practical aspects of it. The clinics are great because you have a professor who is teaching you how to analyze the case law for a particular issue. I did an immigration clinic, a full-year immigration clinic. The professor is guiding you through how to review the statutes that are applicable, what case law is applicable. But at the same time, they're teaching you the practical aspects of things, because you are then, getting a case or two or three to work on, and you have someone who I think can help you blend, both the academic side of things with the practical aspects of being a lawyer. So the best thing I did in law school was to do a clinic. And so I would strongly encourage that.
I think that's great advice. Also speaking as a law school career or former law school career advisor, because that is experience, that's real world experience that goes on your resume, and it definitely makes you marketable. So I wanted to follow up on when you mentioned that you were the first lawyer in your family, which I know we may have other people here who would be the first lawyers in their family who are considering law school. So I wondered if you had any other advice from the perspective of someone who's an undergrad and perhaps doesn't have lawyers in the family and is trying to make the decision about law school, like how they can think about that. Any other advice about that?
So I actually think going to events like this, where either an official event through the Wellesley Career Center like this, where you can, meet people who are in the profession that you are considering, or I know that Wellesley has done a really great job, especially the last few years, in building up the network, seeing if you can work with the Career Center to connect with lawyers who can have those, one-on-one conversations with you about their experiences. I think that's really helpful. For me, it was a little bit of a challenge because at the time I had a lot of friends who were in law school, but they were still like, we were in the same kind of situation, right? Where like they weren't practicing yet. And so it was really helpful for me before going to law school to talk to the different attorneys that I work with, to kind of get their sense of like, would you recommend going to law school? Would you recommend it for me? Here's like what my interests are. And I think you'll find that I would say that like when you first start a job, maybe don't start off right away, like, your first week being like, hi, new supervisor, I want to go to law school. Like, can you help me work through it? I think as you build up that relationship, you'll find that people are really happy and interested and, in talking to you about their experiences. And sometimes if they don't get back to you, it's really just because they don't have time and not because they don't want to share their experiences with you. So I think those are kind of, pre-law school, those are two really great ways to find out whether or not you want to go. And then I think kind of like the second question, which would be, well, once you're in law school, how do you decide what kind of lawyer you want to be or what you want to do? For me, I actually found personally, my clinic professor was extremely helpful because he had, and I think this is probably true of other clinic professors too, they normally have, years of practicing law before they, blend this, practicing and teaching at the same time. And it was really helpful for me to talk to my clinic professor. And I remember one of the things I told him about was being interested in public interest and public service and hoping to have an opportunity to do some work that was more policy based. And it worked out really well because in our clinic, we all got individual cases where we represented a client who's going through a, personal immigration issue. But then we actually were also assigned to a policy matter, where in the case that I was on, we were actually suing the federal government to release information on what ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, how they were implementing some of their enforcement actions. And so that was a really great opportunity. And I think it was, in some part, it was already crafted by my professor. But I think being able to like say, like, this is what I'm interested in, I think he kind of also helped like craft those opportunities. And that's the same thing with internships. I remember actually my first internship in law school, my supervisor was a Wellesley alum, Fiona Oliphant. And she actually, I remember telling her like, oh, I'm kind of struggling with what I want to do. Like, I'm in law school. It doesn't seem the same as working as a lawyer. And being able to talk to her and talk through what I was interested in doing was really helpful. And I felt, very supported by her. And we've kept in touch. And actually our reunion years are the same. I don't know what year she is. I can't remember, but we have the same reunion years. So I run into her at reunions when I go.
That's really cool. Well, can you tell us about your path to the New York City mayor's office and maybe walk us through kind of the steps along the way to your current job?
Sure. So I think in some ways similar to my experience in becoming a lawyer and going to law school, um, I think one of the things that at first was kind of a little bit daunting to me is I'm also not politically connected. And so I was like, when I thought about how do I wind up working in a political office, how will I kind of create a path there? It sometimes felt a little bit daunting to me. But the truth of the matter is I applied for my job online. And actually everyone on my current team applied for their job essentially online. And the things that were really, I think, kind of helpful in terms of the key things that were helpful to my path is one, it is like, taking advantage of those opportunities to talk to people who are lawyers, my professor, the Fiona, to kind of figure out like from your point of view as like a fully like grown adult and lawyer, what are the kind of what pieces of advice do you have for me in terms of if I want to pursue something in public interest? The other thing is, for me, and I don't know how it is for other people, but for me, the path was not direct, right? And so before I came to the mayor's office, I worked for the city, but for an agency where I did litigation. I worked for the Administration for Children's Services. And then I also, on my free time, I volunteered for a political campaign. And so I think, having all those experiences, even though they might not look to someone like this linear path to get to where I am now, which was actually my goal. My job now, I love it. This is like really where, if you would ask me, what do you want to do when you graduate? This would be it. Even though it doesn't seem very linear, I think the thing that is really helpful is to always just kind of think about, well, what are the things that can give me like a leg up, right? Like when I started here, I was not chief of staff. I started off as a junior attorney. But to me, I knew that, it would give me an opportunity to meet people. It would give me an opportunity to see what it's really like working in political office. And hopefully it would give me opportunities to either kind of go up in the ranks in this office, or if not, like find other positions, because, I would see kind of what else is out there. And the other thing is, I also think, with all my varied experiences, the thing that is really important, and I'm sure that Nicole and other folks in the Career Center have said this as well, but it is really important, both in my experience applying to work here, but also in my experience actually being a hiring manager. Do your research before you apply for any job, and frame your cover letter and your resume so that it goes with that position. If you're really interested in a job, don't just use a generic, like, this is my standard, here's my experience, here's my cover letter, please look at me. Show that you've done research. And then once you come in to do the interview, whether it be like a, informational interview or a formal interview, drop the hints, like make the statements that show that you've done research. And it's so easy now because, like, really, in class of 2003, we had the internet, but not everything was like on the internet and on social media at the time. But now there's so much out there. And so even if you can say something like, oh, I saw, I'm really interested in your office. I saw that during the pandemic, you did this panel on the city's response to the pandemic. Can you tell me a little bit, I was really interested in that because I lived through this too. And I was really curious to know about what your team has been doing, with regard to mask mandates or was shutting down the city. Even if you say something that seems like just like a very little thing, I think that's really important because it shows the person you're talking to that you have a real interest, and that you've cared enough to do the research. The other thing is, and I think it actually was not until I interviewed for my current job with my former boss, Maya, whatever skills you have, even if you think it doesn't seem like a direct correlation, like, prepare ahead of time and think about how it relates to this current job. So my prior job, prior to starting here, I was a litigator. I worked for the Administration for Children's Services, and I litigated child abuse and neglect cases. I'm currently chief of staff to the council to the mayor, where we handle policy issues. On its face, it doesn't look like it's related. Like, how would I translate those skills? But I still remember, Maya asking me questions about why I wanted to work here. And also, I remember her telling me, a lot of this job is risk management. How do you handle risk? And I was actually able to explain to her, well, actually, as a litigator, you were handling risk every day, and you were handling it for people, for children. And to me, there's nothing riskier than that. And I was able to explain kind of one of the cases I was on, how I balanced the risks. And I think, that really kind of showed to her that my skills were transferable, and also that I had done my research and I knew a bit about this office and how those skills would translate to this current job.
I love all of that advice so much, Bess, especially like how to show when you're asking questions in an interview that you've done your research. That's always my favorite thing to remind people to prepare, is some really well thought out, well-researched questions. So the next question I was going to ask you was about what a day in your life looks like as chief of staff. But since you mentioned starting as a junior attorney, I thought it might be interesting to start with what a day in the life as a junior attorney in the mayor's office looks like, because that's closer to where our audience members are in their careers.
Sure. So I think for depending kind of which government agency you work for, it'll be different for everyone. But for our office, so basically, I think the two kind of main areas of the work of the Office of the Counsel to the Mayor is, one is providing legal advice on policy issues. That is a huge part of our work. So, for example, with COVID, enforcing, how do we, legally enforce the masking mandate? That was a very small, but that was like one of the policy issues that we had to deal with from a legal perspective. But aside from that, our office, like any general counsel's office, has to deal with what you would consider kind of core GC type of work, core general counsel type of work. And that would be dealing with things like contracts, employment issues, since we're in government, ethics issues, reviewing documents for to comply with something that we have record transparency laws, which in New York is called the Freedom of Information Law. And so when I first started, I spent a lot of time actually working on what are considered the core general counsel issues. So I did a lot of document review in preparation for releasing documents, either because of a lawsuit or because of our compliance with these transparency laws. Or dealing with ethics questions from people. And the ethics questions could be something like, I work for the city, I work at the mayor's office, but I want to take on a part-time job. The entity where I want to take on a part-time job, they have business dealings with the city. Is that okay? So those are the kinds of issues that are kind of like the bread and butter of our work. And so when I started off, I was really focused in those areas. And when my boss at the time had maybe a research question, she would kick it down to the junior folks, the junior attorneys, like, okay, well, here is an issue being raised about, I remember, like, since I had worked in children's services, I actually got a number of issues that related to that agency, legal issues related to them. So there would be questions about, like, social services law. What does this actually mean? What is required for us to comply with it? Do we have to turn these documents over? And so I think starting off, I did a lot of kind of, research and case law review. So that was kind of like at the beginning of my job here. And then as time went on, I actually have just kind of, those core things never disappear because they are always important to anyone in any office. But then I started working on things that were more on the policy side, and things that were kind of more high level sensitive. And in my current role, because as chief of staff, you kind of have to balance two things. One, I still do substantive legal work, but two, I'm doing operational work because my job is to kind of be the right-hand person to the principal, which in my case is the counsel to the mayor. And so, when assignments come in, for example, when my boss is like, I have this meeting in an hour with the mayor, I need to know the background on XYZ issue. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be the one doing all the research, because there are a lot of those questions and there is no one person who can handle all of them. So part of my job is then knowing off the top of my head, well, actually, Anna on my team, she's actually been working on a similar issue. She has background on this. Let me kick this to her. Or, oh, actually, Nicole has some time, so let me give this to her and make sure that she can handle this and get this done in the next hour. So, currently my job is doing both sides, which can be challenging, but it keeps things interesting as well.
It struck me that when you were mentioning like contracts, employment, ethics, like all of these very different areas of law, I just had to ask, how do you make yourself knowledgeable on all of these very different areas? And I assume on a tight time frame sometimes.
Yeah, so actually that's a really good question. And that's something that when we interview people to work here, they both ask us that and we ask them about kind of how they would work in that kind of environment. And so our job is, for the most part, it's not to be the subject matter experts on any given thing, but to know how to see the flags and how to see the risks. So for example, contracts. I am not a contracts attorney, but luckily in the city, so the city of New York is massive, which means we also have a lot of city lawyers. And so with certain contracts issues, if they're very simple, we'll have templates. I'll know how to review them. I'll know kind of the things to look for. But I also know, okay, this is a very complex issue. Let me call a contracts lawyer. And so we luckily have an entity called the New York City Law Department. We work very closely with them. They have 1,000 attorneys compared to our team's 12 attorneys. And so they have a lot of subject matter expertise. And so when there's a contracts issue, I know who to call there. When there's an employment issue, I know who to call there. And so it's really just being able to kind of train yourself. And this is what we do with our junior folks too, is teaching them how to look for, oh, this is an issue where I need to call in an expert on this versus like, this is an issue that I know pretty well. So for example, personally for me, again, contracts is not really my thing. I call contracts people a lot. They're very nice. And I constantly remind them contracts are not my thing. But then they're like, Bess, you actually know more than you think. I'm like, I know, but I'm so glad you guys are around. But for example, employment law. I knew nothing about employment law before I started here. I started here in 2014. But over the years, I've actually kind of now developed an expertise where I actually do know quite a bit about employment issues. And so I won't necessarily have to call someone every time. Ethics issues, same thing. There's a lot of rules and regs that are that we get trained on, but also that there's literally like the New York City Charter, which is essentially the constitution for the city of New York. There's a lot of rules in there that everyone on our team is pretty familiar with. Or a lot of regulations. And then there are like rules and advisory opinions. And kind of when you start getting a lot of these questions about like, can I serve on this board? Can I work in this part-time job? You develop this skill of knowing, oh, actually, I know the answer. I don't have to call someone for this, or I don't necessarily have to like go and flip through all the laws. And so I do think like for our job, it's part of it is being able to be good at just kind of like looking at things and knowing when to ask a question. And then, then the next step is, and this is the part you will also have to learn too, is like knowing who to ask the question of. And so for the most part, you go directly to your supervisor at first, and then they can tell you like, kind of where to go from there. But, I think it's kind of hard to explain until you're actually here, but it is kind of being able to like look at something and balance the risks of it. And then being able to know like who do I call for this, and not being afraid to ask questions or admit you don't know something, right? That's actually how we're good at our jobs. We're not the experts in these things, but we know to be like, I think this is an issue. Let me talk to someone about this.
I wanted to get back a little bit to the COVID response efforts because you touched on that a little bit. And I know that you've done some incredible work on the city's response efforts. So I wondered if you could tell us more about some of the aspects that you worked on and just what that whole experience was like for you.
Sure. So, whether you're from New York or not, I think you'll see that really during COVID, the pandemic really started in March 2020, and the federal government didn't really kind of take a lot of control over the situation, in the sense that they kind of left it up to each state or local jurisdiction to kind of decide how to manage the situation. So in New York City, a lot of what was actually done to respond to the COVID response was ultimately led by the state. But kind of the way it works, and I'm really just going to try to simplify this because I don't want to like drown you guys in legalese. But we obviously have a lot of laws that we have to follow, right? Just broadly, there are a lot of laws, either from the federal government, from the state, from the city. I think taxes are probably the easiest way to explain it, right? You pay your federal taxes, you pay your state taxes, you pay your city taxes. During COVID, even though the laws were still in place, because both actually at the federal level, but they just were a little bit more hands off. At the state and city levels, we declared states of emergency. So the governor declared a state of emergency, the mayor declared a state of emergency. And during a state of emergency, both the governor and the mayor have the authority to issue something called executive orders. So instead of saying, okay, now we have this mandate where everyone has to wear masks, instead of it being a bill that's drafted by the legislature, then you have to wait to get all the buy-in, wait people to vote on it, see if it passes, which is the way laws normally work, during an emergency, our officials can issue orders that essentially have the weight of the law saying, because of this emergency and because of guidance from our public health officials, everyone is now required to wear a mask. Or they're required to social distance, or non-essential businesses need to be closed, people should stay home. So our team at the city level, we draft every single executive order. They're called emergency executive orders. We draft the regular ones too, where like, I don't know, we have other executive orders too, but we drafted every emergency order and continue to draft every emergency order during the state of emergency. And in New York City, these orders have to be renewed every 5 days. So we are constantly working on drafting these orders, reviewing what should be rescinded, what should be in the next version. And I think at this point, I actually didn't count before I dialed in, but I think we've issued about 100 of them. I don't know if the math makes sense. I'm a lawyer, so I don't do math really anymore. But it's somewhere around that amount. And so, our team was in charge of figuring out how to enforce the mask mandates, how to shut down the city of New York, which is, New York City is massive. We have 8.6 million people. I don't even know, like, size-wise, how much square footage we have. It's not actually a lot because we're kind of in a compact space. But we have worked really closely with both the governor's office and obviously with the mayor to implement, and our public health officials to figure out what to do in response to COVID. And for those of you who are from New York and have maybe paid closer attention to this, when New York City shut down, even though ultimately it was the governor who made that decision through his executive order, it was the mayor of New York who first publicly said New York City needs to close down, right? In order to follow the guidance of our public health officials and to hopefully stem the number of infections, we need to shut down. And that is, shutting down the city, it's not that easy. It's not like flipping on and off a switch, right? It's determining, okay, who are considered essential businesses, who should continue to remain open, who should be shut down, and how do we kind of keep them afloat, right? And so one of the things that we've been really proud of that our team worked very closely on is creating something called open dining. And so now, because restaurants had to close, can't social distance, we helped the mayor and the city of New York set up outdoor dining, which sounds easy, but it's not, because New York City, the streets, you can't just throw, tables out there in the streets. There are a lot of regulations on the streets, on the sidewalks, on protecting people, on figuring out with our public health officials, how do we do this safely? How do we let people dine? How do we let these restaurants continue to operate, but do so that we are reducing the spread of COVID? And so our team was really involved in that. And now, as we are so happily moving towards recovery, we were really involved in figuring out, how do we reopen schools safely? Do we test students? How do we get there? How do we get people vaccinated? And one of the things that I was literally just working on is figuring out how to set up incentives for people who, now that we've I think, we have a lot of vaccinations available now. And so how do we encourage people who are still, on the fence about it? How do we encourage people to get vaccinated? And incentives, again, it sounds really simple, but it's not. There's a lot of legal questions related to that. And so, that's something I worked on today, was figuring out, okay, how do we legally create a system where we can give incentives to people to get vaccinated so that we can open up again?
That's really cool to be able to hear your inside perspective on what happened in New York City. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and actually, I forgot to mention this, because this is so different for our legal team. During COVID, we got so many questions. We're still in it now. We had so many questions about, okay, there's all these executive orders, there's all these regulations, what do they mean? And so one of the things that our team started to do was to take on a more public-facing role. We actually have, which is, I think, really unique for lawyers. Lawyers are usually advising their clients and kind of in the background. But we were getting so many questions about the laws that we launched a Twitter account at NYC Mayor Council, and a website, nyc.gov/council to the mayor, where we put up all these easy to read translated FAQs about things like, at the time, there were all these traveler restrictions. If you came into New York City, you had to fill out certain forms and you had to isolate. So we put up all these easy to read FAQs, so that people could get a better sense of like, what do I have to do? There's so many laws and they're changing every day. Like, how do we stay in compliance? And actually, as a result of that, we also launched a podcast. I know that was like a very popular thing to do during the pandemic. I never thought that I would be involved in a podcast, frankly. But we launched a podcast called City Hall Pass, which is actually on like Spotify and like Apple Podcasts store, or whatever it's called, where we interview people, including our public health officials, so that they can give more insight into, your city is doing so much. And I think it's been more visible during the pandemic because we have had to take these drastic steps, like, shutting down businesses that, I think give some insight into like, what does government do? And like, what are they doing for you? Especially as, especially in response to the pandemic.
That's cool. I'm going to look that up and put the link in the chat for everyone. But I wanted to take a step back and talk more about kind of public service generally, knowing that some people here might be seeking careers in government. I wondered if you could just speak to what you see as some of the greatest challenges and rewards of working in public service.
So I think challenges, I think practically speaking, government it's large, right? So it's still a bureaucracy. And depending on where you work, there might be many layers of approval that you need to get, or a lot of buy-in that you need to get before something can be implemented. It's a little bit, frankly, easier from where I am because I work for the mayor's office and for the mayor. So we're essentially the center of government. So all the decisions are kind of coming in to us versus like if I worked at an agency, at an agency, in order to do something, you might have to send everything in to the mayor's office and to get approval for those things. I do think that working in government kind of more broadly, it probably is one of the most challenging jobs there is, because whether you work in New York City or for another jurisdiction, whether you work for federal, state, Boston, everything you do is high stakes because anything you do, it affects countless numbers of people. In New York, as I mentioned, we have 8.6 million people. When you work on an issue, it might seem like maybe you're only working an issue that affects one person, but it rarely does, right? It will affect hundreds of people. And so I think it's really, that could be the challenge, right? It's like remembering that you're not just representing yourself, and not always just representing your agency or like your boss, but actually representing all the people of New York. But I actually think that's why I really enjoy working in government. I love my job. I think, I grew up in New York. I'm from New York City. Having the ability to serve my own city is really just, it's incredible. And I thought that I was like an informed person before I started working here. Like, I read the news, like I check things on Twitter. I know what's going on. But now that I work here, I actually see more clearly everything that's going on. And maybe not everything, that's a bit much. Like you can't know everything that's going on. But I see more clearly, what is being done in New York City, what is being done that affects me, affects my family, affects my friends, affects my neighbors. And, things that are being done to hopefully make life better for everyone. And it's just really cool. Like, it's just like, it still remains to me just like, wow, this is a really cool job. And it's really cool that I get to do this and be part of this. And I think, we've talked about this a lot, kind of more recently in light of the pandemic. I have such gratitude for our frontline workers, right? Like whether they be our medical staff, the grocery store workers, our facilities folks who keep our buildings clean, our sanitation folks who keep our streets clean, MTA who keeps everything running, like the cities, the buses running, the subways running. But one of the things that I think brought me real I mean, COVID was challenging. We were working, I worked a lot already, but we were working 24/7 during COVID. And it's hard being in, you can't really see it, but I have a very tiny New York City apartment and just being here like by myself and like just looking out the window and not even seeing people walking around because everyone else is also staying at home by themselves or with whoever. Um, but working for the city, working for government, every day when I was doing work, I knew I was doing something that was affecting the people of New York and doing something to hopefully keep them safe, and protecting them. And I think that's the kind of thing that I'm not going to say that you can't find that satisfaction in other jobs, but I've really found that working for government.
Well, I think that's probably a really good note for me to stop asking you questions on, and for us to allow the last 15 minutes for others to ask questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording now. And if people would like to, turn off video and ask questions, or if you feel more comfortable, you can always private chat them to me or put them in the chat, whatever works for everyone. And I have a couple more questions in my back pocket too. So I'll turn off the recording.